Hello, everyone. Welcome to an IPR session on politicians and economic experts, the limits of the technocracy. Today, we are joined by Dr. Anna Killick, who is the research fellow in the Department of Political Science at University College London. She's a graduate of Oxford University in the politician's favorite course, Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. She's previously worked for the National Consumer Council and Charter BB as a parliamentary officer. She taught history and politics in comprehensive schools before returning to academia. She studied for her doctorate at the University of Southampton, focusing on the perceptions of the economy. And she has worked in that area ever since, using qualitative methods of research to look into the beliefs of both the everyday and elite actors in the economy. So without further ado, I hand over to Anna.
Hi, thank you, Charlie. And it's great to be online with the University of Bath. In some ways, it's probably just as well that I'm physically not in the University of Bath delivering this lecture, because I lived there in the early 90s, and I remember I used to spend a lot of time driving round and round and round it, trying to pass my test, which I didn't for many times, and I slightly blame the hills of Bath. But anyway, it's great to be here, and what I'd like to do is, if I can just share my screen. Okay, so the title of your lecture series is Polycrisis, and I've seen the other lectures, and it's been I think a great initiative. My contribution is going to be about two of the groups of people who could sort out the polycrisis. Politicians and economists, and it's also about which one of them voters should put their faith in and why. Now, I'm going to start in quite a binary way, and I think you may just have caught a glimpse of him when I was setting up, with politician Michael Gove. Now, it's pretty clear which one of his his quotes I'm going to be calling on, probably his most famous quote in the run-up to the referendum on leaving the European Union, where he said, "I think the people in this country have had enough of experts." And it's really clear that the experts that he was referring to were economic experts. This was at a point when there had just been a lot of Treasury forecasts about what the effects of leaving the EU would be. And I'm sure even if Michael Gove was involved in this lecture today, he would say, yes, it was economic experts that I meant. And he's attempting to appeal to both sides of the Leave coalition. So on the one hand, working class voters, often in northern seats, who have come to be known as the Red Wall voters, who may have felt that economic experts had been in the driving seat during the neoliberal decades of, Thatcher onwards, and that they had failed to see the 2008 financial crisis coming, and that they had then in quite a strong way been associated with the banks, who were the big problem during the 2008 financial crisis, the subsequent bailout of the banks, which many voters had strong feelings about. And what Michael Gove is really doing is appealing to their anti-economist feeling, but don't forget, he's also appealing to those more middle-class conservative voters, potential Leave supporters, who, for example, right now, are often critical of economists and other experts for being too liberal, for being part of the establishment. And we see a lot of criticism of the blob at Whitehall. So the people that Michael Gove is appealing to are anti-expert, but I think he knew that they were particularly anti-economic experts. So many of them subsequently did trust epidemiologists, health experts, but there is something about that category, economist, which doesn't equate in their minds, in those voters' minds, with full expertise. So we're going to be thinking about Michael Gove as a politician throughout the lecture. And what I'm going to be doing here is giving you a brief setup of my argument before I then unpack the various strands. However, the other group of people who could get us out of the polycrisis are economists. And here we have Nicholas Stern, who I think a lot of people would respect as one of the leading voices on the economics of climate change. And based at the LSE with impeccable expert credentials. Now, one of the things that is most interesting about experts, economic experts right now, is that in the past, the left were fairly suspicious of them. You know, there was a sense that they had been too pro-market during the neoliberal decades. Whereas because economists do seem to have been fairly prominent recently on the need for economic action on climate change, a lot of environmentalists will say not radical enough, but nevertheless prominent enough that, for example, a group of them, 50 very eminent economists, wrote to the Wall Street Journal in January 2019 calling for action on climate change. There's an article by Howard and Sylvan from 2021 saying that he thinks that saying that they think that there is quite a strong consensus on among economists on the need for action. I think that there are some people on the centre left, and I'm using that phrase very broadly today, who are probably slightly more favourable towards the idea that economists should get greater prominence than they would have been 40 years ago. And I think particularly when it comes to the economics of climate change, I think perhaps economists might be seen as slightly less trustworthy from a centre-left perspective on things like reducing inequality. But when it comes to climate change, particularly because of its long-term nature and the need for action that is steady and stretches out into the future, I think that there are more people on the centre-left who are calling for a more prominent role for them. And the term that is often used for a more prominent role for experts, including economic experts, is technocracy. So I think that I am seeing some greater support for an economic technocracy, in large part, I think, to give a solution on climate change. Now, my argument in the lecture is going to be that even though that may be tempting, technocracy, I don't think we should succumb to it. So on the basis of the research that I did, I think that we are in a position where we have to continue to have politicians in the driving seat, as it were. So in the rest of the lecture, I'm going to describe the research that this conclusion is based on. I'm going to outline what politicians in my research thought about economists, which is a crucial part of the jigsaw that's often neglected. And I'm going to talk a bit about the economists in the other countries that we researched, Denmark, Germany, France, and the US, but I will have mainly a focus on the UK. And then I'm going to channel what the politicians were saying about technocracy into what I think is one potential solution to the poly crisis about how they communicate, how politicians communicate on economic stuff. Okay, so hopefully that's an overview, and I'm now going to look briefly at the research. What was the research we did? And I was part of a team at University College London, led by Lucy Barnes, who is a leading academic in political economy. And as a result of that research, which was funded, by the way, by UKRI, I produced a book, Politicians and Economic Experts, as part of the, if you like, the politicians strand of that UCL research. And it's published by Agenda, should anyone want to get hold of a copy. The research was based on interviewing 99 politicians. We were supposed to interview 100, but the axe fell at an awkward point. So frustrating as it is, we only got to 99. And they were from across the political parties. We did manage to interview politicians from some far-right parties in Germany and Denmark, but we did not manage to persuade politicians from National Front in France. It used to be called National Front, it's now called Rassemblement, to come forward. So there is some patchiness about how much we managed to get across the full political spectrum from far left to far right. But, we did as well as we could. And we interviewed from the 5 countries on the slide, all advanced or advanced economically and democracies. Our interviews were confidential, and this is really important because it meant that politicians were perhaps slightly more honest, slightly more reflective than they are sometimes when they're interviewed about policies that they have been particularly identified with and where they're going to be able to get their name and their account across. So I think there are insights from the politicians, and the way we did the questions, where we asked all of them the same 7 or 8 open-ended questions, and then were able to compare what was front of mind for them in the way that they answered. And finally, the timing of the interviews, we conducted them, not intentionally, during the pandemic. And it's quite interesting that almost the least interesting points they made were about the pandemic itself and lockdown and the economic effects, and that what seemed to preoccupy them a lot in thinking about their economic ideas and the role of economists was a perspective that stretched back over the last 3 or 4 decades. And in addition, there were, for a section of them, about a third of them, big climate issues in what was front of mind for them about economists and economic issues. Towards the end of our interviews, we were getting into the supply chain problems that everyone remembers starting at the end of the pandemic. So that was foreshadowing that there was about to be a cost of living crisis, but that crisis was not quite so prominent as it has since become since 2021. So that's a little bit about the research. And I'd now like to move on to, well, what attitudes did the politicians have to economists, which I think is one bit of research which has been a bit neglected in the past. And the first general finding that we were surprised by, if you think about writers like Marion Fourcade, Stephanie Mudge, who found that there was an increasing prominence of economists within policymaking as advisors to politicians over the 4 decades from the 1980s onwards, then you might expect the politicians in our interviews to talk about economists quite a lot. But I think the first finding that we had was that, in a way, there were a low number of references to economists, lower than we would expect. It's almost as if the politicians wanted to talk about their own economic ideas rather than to talk about economists. And we also got the feeling that they didn't spend a lot of time reading the ideas of economists. And this was true even of politicians who had done economics as their first degree. And because we interviewed politicians who had an interest in economics, some of them had been finance ministers, some of them had been backbenchers, but they'd been backbenchers on economic committees. Quite a high proportion of them had actually studied economics, more than is the case for the general cohort of politicians. And yet, even so, we get what we think is a relatively low number of references to economists. So there were about 1/4 of our interviewees who in hour-long interviews didn't really mention named economists or schools of economists at all. What about those politicians who did say, I have been influenced by economist X or the school of economists X? What I'm about to show you is, remember, there's 100 politicians. The number of politicians who did make positive references, and also the number of those references made. Now, this is a little bit like, you know, your top 10 of which economists were in their minds. And it wasn't a huge surprise to us that Keynes was going to come out in top place. But if you look there, you've also got, we interpreted this quite sort of generously, if you like, you've got politicians saying, I believe in the liberal economics or the liberal school of economics. And then a huge variety from, well, I believe in Danish or Scandinavian economists, where a sort of particular nationality is referenced. Ludwig Erhard, who of course was mentioned more by German economists, German politicians, and then a few free market ones. So if you just think of the second point I make at the top of that slide, we also felt that they were very partial in which economists they mentioned. So it's no surprise that it was mainly politicians on the centre left who mentioned Keynes. They felt that Keynes had kind of given them permission to be redistributive and, you know, generally to go in that social democrat direction. Whereas it was mainly politicians on the centre right who would say, I support liberal economics, or if then pressed, would go on to Hayek, or would voluntarily mention Hayek in some cases, and Adam Smith perhaps, or Friedman, Milton Friedman, or, you know, the free market category. And you've obviously got only really far left politicians from parties like Die Linke mentioning somebody like Marx. But we felt generally that, and we asked these politicians, you know, how useful do you find economists? So that was one of our direct questions, that what they would say is, first of all, that they did feel economists weren't like other experts, and that, you know, they therefore only really found their branch of economists, Keynes if they were social democrats, useful to them as politicians. There wasn't much sense that they respect the discipline of economics as a whole in the way that they might have said, in the pandemic, I respected the epidemiologists as a whole and thought there was some kind of a consensus there, rather than epidemiologists being divided along these quite partisan lines. They also were quite critical of economists, not all of them, but a substantial proportion, well over half, spent quite a lot of time when asked how useful they found them, talking about how they do think that economists are still not practical enough, still not oriented enough to the real policy world that the politicians are dealing with. So I think to conclude on, what is the attitude of politicians overall to economists, we felt overall a slightly lower level of respect for them as a profession than we might have expected, and a strong tendency to say the thing with economists is we bring them in certain situations, but it's always us who are left to shoulder the responsibility after they've left the room, and that we as politicians, for example, during the 2008 financial crisis and in other big crises since, feel that we are responsible and that we shoulder the responsibility for economic policy making. Now, were there any national variations in this kind of respect for or perception of usefulness of economists? I would say that in our league table of 5 countries, the UK was at the bottom with the US when it came to respect for economists. So, this is going to look as if I'm just confirming stereotypes about a lot of other literature, which shows that countries like Germany and Denmark, which both have more coordinated economies, more, agreement between, for example, trade unionists and employers about try to bring them together, developing economic policy, but also greater tendency to have coalition government, meaning that there is also perhaps a more of a style of trying to reach consensus in those countries. But, it is what we found. So we tried to go into the interviews with an open mind, but nevertheless, we were really struck. If you look at the point about Danish politicians, and there is obviously much more detail in the book about this, that they would talk about how they felt there was a political consensus, a Scandinavian model for economic policy making in Denmark, and that in addition, the economists, the Danish economists, were part of that political consensus. And so slightly less of a sense in Denmark that the economists are too abstract or not practical enough. A tendency to indicate that economists are more useful to them than is the case in the UK. And then the German politicians indicated there was more of a division. There's been a huge debate in Germany regarding economic policy, with the centre-left perhaps trying to adopt more Keynesian ideas about how it may sometimes be justified to go into debt compared to the previous commitment to a more ordoliberal stance on how debt is to be avoided at all costs. But nevertheless, a slightly greater tendency, for example, to talk about economists as scientists, to talk about institutions like the Council for Economic Advisors that exists in Germany and also in Denmark. And it also exists in America. But in contrast, the German politicians would tend to talk about those institutions as if they paid them more attention and had more respect for the expertise that was underlying them. We then come to the really really interesting case of France, where economists have often complained that they don't get a hearing. And we found almost the greatest attention of all to economists coming from French politicians, you know, in terms of how much they were reading them, how much they seemed to be up to date with kind of leading politicians at the cutting edge of current debates. But the thing that's curious as well is that French politicians seem to think that it was a virtue of economics that it was pluralist. In other words, that they had no expectation that economics would be like a hard science. And what they tended to do was to recognize that you would have economists who might be in a very environmentalist direction, people like Kate Raworth. You would then have economists who might be in a more kind of neoclassical direction, and you would try to listen to the range. So, you know, almost a sense that economics can be respected for the expert insights, but only if it's viewed as effectively another social science. And then finally, here we have the UK, and I think UK politicians on the centre-left tended to talk about Keynes, as we've said, but in a very loose way, as if, you know, oh, I'm a Keynesian, and then a little bit of a laugh, you know, although that doesn't mean very much. And then we did find some UK left politicians and politicians in the Green Party have been reading economists in perhaps a bit more depth, looking up on issues like universal basic income, for example. But, you know, if we were to take, apart from perhaps those far left and Green politicians in the UK, if we were to take UK politicians as a whole, there was a bit, you know, it was a sense that if they were on the right, then they had a moment in their youth when they looked at Milton Friedman, but that ever since then, they had been much more pragmatic in their approach to drawing on economists, and their general approach to economic policy making, they claimed, was a pragmatic one, which again is something that comes across in a lot of literature, particularly about British conservatism, but we found that our interviews did seem to reflect it. Slight differences between the way the UK is inattentive to economists compared to the way in which the US politicians were inattentive to economists compared to the other three countries, in the sense that the US politicians were even more partisan in their approach to economists and tended to say, you know, I only draw on economists when I need debating points against my opponents. And there was a greater tendency among American politicians not to mention what we would recognize as schools of economists, you know, in the sense of free market, perhaps, but more to actually talk about Democrat economists, i.e. those that they thought were identified with the Democrat position, or even conservative with a small c, or Republican economists, and to put that label in front of their names. So the kind of conclusion on the respect for economists is that maybe in the UK and the US in particular, but to an extent across all 5 countries, we felt that politicians didn't look or sound as if they were about to give up further power to economists. So those people who are attracted to the idea of technocracy, it seems unlikely that the politicians will lead us down that route. So the final part of the lecture, I'm just going to go into the other strand of what the politicians said, which is that they felt it was undesirable that they should cede any further power to economists. And this is really all to do with the undermining of democracy. And there was a bit of a sense of past, I think I've got about 10 minutes left, so it should be okay. There's a bit of a sense that when politicians in the 1980s onwards depoliticized economic policy making, gave independence to central banks, handed over, in the UK's case, nationalized industries to privatized companies, or, arms reach agencies, there had been a hope that this kind of depoliticization of economic policy would stop politicians being blamed when things went wrong. And the politicians we interviewed feel, 2020, 2021, that strategy didn't really work. They say that voters still overestimate what they are capable of doing in economic policy. In other words, voters have not scaled down what they think politicians should be doing in economic policy. And I think they also feel that the past depoliticization and any future advance towards technocracy would fuel populism. So here, what I think illustrated it most strongly was the French politicians talking about the recent yellow vest protests. So there was a sense here that from French politicians that lower middle class and rural voters who hadn't perhaps been that vocal on economic policy became angered by fuel taxes and other taxes that they thought were unfair. And this sparked the yellow vest protests. And on the one hand, some of these politicians say, well, at least it brought economic issues further up the political agenda. But on the other hand, if they kind of equate some of the arguments made by yellow vest protesters also with the increased support for Rassemblement, what used to be the Front National in France, the far-right Marine Le Pen party, which offers very simplistic economic solutions, then, the fear is that the past saying, oh, the economic policy is in the hands of the experts, just made those voters feel that politicians were deliberately using that as an excuse, and it made them more likely to turn away from centrist politicians towards those politicians who are saying, oh, we can sort out the economic policy and we can produce a miracle solution very quickly. And you might say that there are big elements of that in the way that Trump pitched how he would solve the economic policies of voters in America. So I think there is a fear that we're now going to hand this policy over to experts who will decide how to pay to mitigate climate change, for example, would lead to a further backlash similar to the backlash that we've had in the last 7 or 8 years against centrist parties. So I think that's the first strand of why centrist politicians we interviewed thought it would be undesirable. But the second part is a little bit more complicated, which is that actually politicians do want to hang on to economic policy because they are actually quite moralistic in the way that they see economic policy. And we use the term that they had economic visions. Now, they tell you this in confidential interviews. So in our confidential interviews, they would say quite surprisingly emotional or passionate or moral things about what they feel should happen in economic policy. So I've got a few quotes there. It was very common for them to say, my vision for what should happen with the economy is what drove me into politics. And at the point when I was teenage, when I was becoming politically aware, that's when I was observing either that my neighbours were living in poverty, and that made me think that I wanted an economic vision which was about restoring social justice, or alternatively, I was growing up in Britain in the 1970s, and I felt that the stranglehold of Labour governments on something that I felt was the spirit of the entrepreneur, trying to break free and innovate and drive Britain forward, is what drove me in a centre-right direction. I've just got three quotes there. The first one is from a German social democrat. I went into politics to achieve social justice, a fairer world. That's what my economic vision is. The second one from a Danish conservative who immediately says, I value certain traditions, uses the word value. For him, actually, environmental sustainability, family and community were in his particular Christian Democrat approach to the economy. But then the final one is from an American Republican. And there's this sort of idea, I think perhaps more from outside the States, that the market reigns supreme. But that doesn't mean that some American Republicans see it in a very dispassionate way. They actually see the values underpinning free markets as quite moralistic. And this Republican in the third quote talks about there's an underlying philosophy that drives his economic vision. The economic questions are value-based questions. They're to do with the deeper magic of human dignity, about striving and kind of making an effort. So on the one hand, we've got these very economic visions that the politicians tell us about in interviews. But on the other hand, they think voters see the economy really differently. So in that first bullet point there, what I'm saying is that I think that when politicians talk to voters about social policy, crime, for example, they, if they're a conservative, for example, probably have a pro-strict punishment predisposition, and they feel they can talk to voters about that quite openly, because voters will also have a kind of, or the ones they're trying to appeal to, quite a strict pro-punishment predisposition. But these politicians, when it comes to talking about economic policy, they have a moral economic vision. But when we ask them, how do you think voters see the economy? Virtually every single one of them, it was the most universally common answer they gave us, think that voters just see the economy through the prism of their own well-being. In other words, they think voters are self-interested and, not interested in the bigger picture, just how their family, their households are doing. So we think that this makes politicians doubly inhibited when it comes to talking in depth about economic policy. In other words, and they don't condemn voters for their narrow self-interest, or for something that you could call ignorance about the technical side of economics. Economists often refer to voters as ignorant on the technical side of it. Because I think they want to be positive about the way they see voters, but they do find it difficult to talk to voters about economic policy. And we have seen, particularly perhaps in the last 20 years, politicians almost shying away from economic issues at all, and focusing more on the cultural, is one of the reasons that there has been a bit of a tendency for that actually they find that voters don't have the technical knowledge to understand some of the detail about what they're proposing, and B, they're having to tone down their own moralistic economic visions because of trying to appeal to the maximum number of self-interested voters. So this really kind of brings me to my final conclusion, which is that if we've got a problem for politicians communicating with voters about economics, but we've also got politicians saying that they're not going to give more power on economic policy to economic experts, how are politicians going to contribute more than they have been doing to getting us out of the poly crisis? And it does seem to me that the main solution lies in politicians communicating better with voters. So there are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, politicians in the interviews recognised that economists weren't very good at communicating economic issues, and they were fairly dismissive of the role of the media in doing that, or even schools trying to do some kind of economic education, which probably only ever can go so far, because you need to have people out in the real world working and paying taxes before you really grab their attention. So politicians did see themselves as the best communicators with voters. And I think there is an extent to which they're right about this. Okay, a lot of voters are inattentive and can't stand talking to politicians, but nevertheless, there is that constant campaigning and a kind of contract between politician and voter that does take place. So I think politicians have got to do a tricky thing. They've got to be more honest with voters that they do have moral economic visions, and perhaps somebody like Keir Starmer, it's a little bit frustrating that he has been toning down some of what is usually seen as Labour's drive for social justice a bit too much in order to appeal to the middle ground voters. But they've got to be clearer on the technical detail at the same time. And we have seen glimmers of this. We have seen free trade supporters in the Republican Party in the US, for example, spending quite a lot of time trying to explain why free trade is better than protection, using everyday methods or everyday props to do so. To give them some credit, the Conservative Party leadership contestants were talking about inflation in some detail at various points of that contest. So, I think that there is potential for politicians to do this, but it is, whether it's on the economics of climate change or economic policy more broadly, a very good theorist who we found relevant, Jane Mansbridge, has written about this, that there is a sense in which politicians need to educate voters more on economic policy, not in a kind of teachery way, but in this sense of being both more honest about the morality of their own visions and clearer about the technical detail. So I'm sorry if that is too much of a whiz through, but I'll leave it there and hope there are some questions and I can clarify in those.
Okay, thanks very much, Anna. That was fascinating. As an economist by training, I won't take any of it personally. We've got some questions here. I'll start out with one from one of our own researchers, Dr. Joe Crisp, and he asked the question about whether or not there's a difference in your interviews between those that were backbenchers versus those that would have been in cabinet or in more senior political positions, and how they engage with expertise and with economic expertise in particular.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, the ones who had been finance ministers, and we did have quite a few from across countries and parties, said that they had obviously relied on their civil servants, their economist civil servants, as well as economic advisors. But I think their frustration was that, when they needed a civil servant to look at the implications of a policy, that was done effectively. But I think their frustration was that when it came to economists outside the civil service, so those who would perhaps be seen as kind of in some way independent and also operating at a more intellectual level, that was where they felt that even there they might bring a couple of economists in from outside, and that it wasn't presented clearly enough for them as politicians. In terms of the ones on backbench committees, I would say that they tended to follow the kind of national trends or the ideological trends that I've mentioned, so perhaps be slightly less attentive if they were from the UK or the US. And also to go in, if they were going to mention an economist, go in those kind of slightly superficial party lines of, if they're centre-left, mention Keynes. So I wouldn't have said a huge difference. I think mainly from those who'd been finance ministers, we got the sense that even if they respected economists, they did feel that they had been in the driving seat.
And just to sort of maybe clarify and build on that question, is there a sense in their own mind did they articulate that there's possibly, in their view, a difference between, let's say, somebody who arrives as part of the government economic service in the UK versus somebody who's called an economist who's sitting in Cambridge, for example? I mean, do they not think of a GES civil servant as an economist, but as essentially a technical civil servant that happens to be trained in economics as opposed to engineering or whatever? And is there a distinction of that nature in the way that those senior ministers engage with their civil servants, so that when you ask them about economists, perhaps there's a category difference in how they think about economists between the Cambridge Don and the senior GES person?
There was a bit of a split on this, that some of them would say that, they saw the economists in the Treasury, for example, as very different from the other civil servants in the Treasury, that even there, the economists spoke in a different way and presented them with policy options in a different way. And some of them were critical of that. So, it was a mixed picture as far as that's concerned. And I think it's hard to generalize. So, for example, in Denmark, apart from maybe nationally, in the sense that in Denmark, there seemed to be much less of a division between the way they saw the economists who were embedded in the government machine and the way they saw the ones in the university. And that may be something to do with it being a smaller country, but they saw the links between those two types of economists much more strongly than in the other countries.
Okay. And we have another question which looks at the issue of Liz Truss and her rejection of the Bank of England and the OBR. And is there an element in the Conservative Party where they try to erect barriers to the acceptance of those types of economic expertise because it rejects their agenda politically? Is there something particular about that Liz Truss moment?
Well, that our interviews finishing in 2021 could not really have predicted Liz Truss, in the sense that I think she was unusual within the context of the Conservative Party, maybe not quite so unusual within the context of the American Republicans. And the fact that they got rid of her after 6 weeks is kind of testament to that. I think that, first of all, you could say that in the contest before she was selected, she did at least go on and on about economic policy. There was a Labour, when Keir Starmer was elected Labour leader, if you look at the television debates that took place then, you'll find that often under 10% of the time is spent talking about economic policy. Okay. So some credit to the fact that Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss spent a lot of time arguing about how to deal with inflation, because I think inflation has also engaged voters' attentions in the way that no other economic policy ever has. And if we think that voters being engaged is a bit of a step on educating voters, then in a strange kind of way, inflation has that one tiny positive effect. But I would say that while I would have described the other Conservative MPs that we interviewed as pragmatic, they didn't go out of their way to attack the institutions, whether it was the Bank of England or the OBR, in the way that Truss did. And I do think that in that sense, she was an outlier.
Okay, very, very good. In terms of the distancing of politicians from economists and economic experts, is that in your mind part of a sort of self-preservation response to the populist movement that the Trump administration, the Johnson administration, the Modi administration are defined as, in part by their anti-expert mentalities, and that this distancing is in fact, the political system and politicians individually trying to find their way in that new political discourse?
That's really interesting, because I think that, again, I think that the Johnsonian Conservatives and the Republicans are quite distinct in that respect. So the other politicians, the more kind of across the 5 countries, slightly more mainstream politicians that we interviewed, while I would say that they had a lower level of respect for economists than we might have expected because of the slightly lower level of attention in the interviews than you might have expected, and also the sense of economists as partial, left or right, they nevertheless didn't want to go as far as having, if you like, inexpert economic policy, or they wanted to produce economic policy that would work and that would be based on practical expert advice. So they criticized a lot of the American politicians, including some Republicans, really criticized Trump. And it's really interesting that some of the Republicans weren't so angry with the content of the policy, even though they disagreed. For example, some of them were free trade, he'd introduced tariffs. They were more deeply angry that he had demagogued the issue and made it impossible for them to give coherent economic narratives to voters in the future. So it's kind of almost how much he had degraded economic messages, rendered them completely incoherent, than the content.
Hey, Donald Trump renders something incoherent. Well, that's a very interesting thought. In terms of looking at other parts of Europe, especially in light of the crisis and the Eurozone crisis and IMF bailouts, do you think that those politicians would have responded differently to your queries? And I noted your conversation about the population, the voters being effectively ignorant of economics, and I'm reminded of the frighteningly good knowledge of the bond markets of Dublin taximen in the immediate aftermath of the IMF bailout in Ireland, and just the extent to which perhaps that conversation would be slightly different in those countries that were in a much more acute economic situation.
Yes, so it's a pity that, for example, we did only interview in France, Germany, and Denmark, and the UK, from the European side. And we did get a lot of interesting material from Alternative for Deutschland and other Christian Democrat politicians about why they had the stance that they'd had during the Eurozone crisis. Is your question kind of about whether their perception of voter economic knowledge varies?
Well, does their voter knowledge, does their perception vary, and does their engagement with economic experts vary given their experience? So you look at Greece, for example, and of course the brief moment in Varoufakis is economist rock star in government. In AFD, the fact that Hans Werner Zinn was so prominent for the initial 6 months of that party, and the conversations that would have happened about between economists and the role of experts, be it the European Central Bank or the IMF, in countries such as Portugal and in Ireland during that time, and the different ways in which politicians would engage with economists of different stripes at that time.
Yeah, I mean, because our interviews were only in France, Germany, Denmark, and the UK on the European front, I can only draw on the work that has been done about the role of economic experts. For example, in sort of South America, there's been a huge literature on how, and similarly in Greece, how economists can be catapulted in as finance ministers and given a much more prominent role, in a more classic attempt to go in a technocratic direction. And I think that what's interesting, there's a recent excellent book on technocracy edited by Karamini and Heribert Su. And I think that it is interesting that the form of democracy that can take place in France, Germany, Denmark, UK, and US is much more that politicians stay in the driving seat. And if they're going to bring economists in, it will be as advisors or in agencies, but they won't, constitutionally, they kind of can't catapult them in like that. And in terms of politician perception of the role of economists, because these were countries that came out less obviously in crisis from the 2008 financial crisis, I think that all of them did share a sense that the 2008 financial crisis had been a watershed and that it had increased voter opposition to economic expertise. But even some of the German politicians who said, I've always respected economists, I've always seen them as people of science, said, I have been less sure since the 2008 financial crisis that they understand, the economic crises facing our country. So even quite sort of previously firmly ordo-liberal, if you like, German politicians were saying, I do wonder whether behavioural economics might give us more insights, because, you know, the ones I used to trust don't seem to be describing, or, you know, what they describe about the way something like interest rates work doesn't seem to be as true as it used to be. So I would say increasing skepticism from those politicians who had previously claimed to have trusted neoclassical economists, or ordoliberal in the case of the German politicians.
Okay, excellent. Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time. I'd just like to thank Anna for her presentation. It is a very interesting book. I strongly recommend that that people purchase the book. There's a link in the chat, which will bring you directly to the page to buy it from Agenda Publishing. Again, it's Politicians and Economic Experts, The Limits of the Technocracy. And it just falls to me to thank Anna for a fascinating and useful contribution to our series on the poly crisis, and to bid her a good day, and good day to all of you who have been watching us online, and hopefully you still think well of us poor economists out there.